Hey yo, back at it again with another video. Thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate it. So, today is Sunday, October the 27th, 2024, at about 8 o'clock at night. That is time of recording. So, I kind of want to touch on different things that have been happening within the war in Ukraine. First thing I want to talk about is the Ukrainian advance into Kursk. I haven't heard of a whole lot of movement along this area of the front lately. The Ukrainians have been advancing into Kursk for about 2-3 months now at this point. The parts of the line that I want to talk about are this part of the line around the northern part around Lysychansk and the middle portion of the line around Donetsk. So up here around Belgorod, there was a Russian advance a couple months ago around Vovchansk. That didn't really amount to a whole lot. I mean, there was territory that the Russians were able to capture, but not a whole lot. The part of the line that I really want to talk about is the area around Kupiansk. So it looks like the Russians have made an advance from Pischane towards the Oskil Reservoir. So it looks like around Pischane and more or less around Kupiansk that the Ukrainians in this part of the line are surrounded on three sides. So if to the north, to their east, and the Russian advance around Pischane to their south. It looks like what the Russians are trying to do is to ultimately force the Ukrainians in this part of the line back towards Kupiansk and onto this side of the body of water. So this is the Oskil Reservoir. This is the Oskil River. And it looks like what the Russians are trying to do is, now that they've had an advance around Pischane, Berestove towards Sankove, ultimately what they're trying to do is to encircle the Ukrainians on three sides, and then ultimately push the Ukrainians back across the Oskil Reservoir River. I mean, it looks like a creek up here, honestly. But around Kupiansk and around Pischane, it looks like the Ukrainians are now surrounded on three sides because the Russians have now forced their way from Berestove, Pischane towards Sankove. So the Ukrainians are encircled on three sides around Kupiansk. Looks like the Russians are also trying to make an advance around Andriivka. Ultimately try and push. Looks like they're trying to push towards Borova. But looks like this Russian advance here has been more successful than this Russian advance. So the Russians, looks like what the Russians are trying to do is force the Ukrainians back towards Kupiansk and onto the west side of the Oskil Reservoir. If you remember from the Kharkiv offensive, this green area, Kupiansk was a major. Kupiansk, Izium, and Liman were three key cities Ukraine retook because those were major logistical hubs. So if the Ukrainians are then forced back towards Kupiansk and towards the western side of the Oskil Reservoir, then that would put Kupiansk back into play for the Russians. It looks like that's what their goal is up here. They're trying to make advances towards Borova, but it doesn't look like that advance has been as successful as this advance around Pischane. Okay. Next part of the line I want to talk about around Chasiv Yar. Not a whole lot of movement, but it looks like the Russians are trying to force an advance along this road, and it looks like they're trying to make an advance along this road, basically trying to make advances to Chasiv Yar's north and Chasiv Yar's south, because as of right now, the only thing that the Russians have been able to take in Chasiv Yar is the Canal microdistrict, made some advances along this part of the, I don't know, it looks like a suburb of Chasiv Yar, or I don't know if that's just a neighborhood. I'm not entirely sure. But the Russians have had the Canal Microdistrict. It looks like they're trying to push towards Chasiv Yar, but it also looks like they're trying to more or less try and advance to its north, to its south, and try and maybe do a pincer movement. But it does not look like the Russians are successful in that area as of yet. Not a whole lot of movement on this part of the line. Nelipivka is still contested. Toretsk is still being fought over. The Russians have made some gains to Toretsk's south and east. Nelipivka is still contested. New York is more or less under Russian control. This is the really big bulge in the line. The Russians, after taking Avdiivka, Ocheretine, have really pushed towards Pokrovsk. And if the Russians are able to take Pokrovsk, that would be a serious blow to the Ukrainians, because Pokrovsk is a major logistics area for road and rail, pushing troops towards the front in the Pokrovsk area, but also around the Chasiv Yar area of the line. So the Ukrainians are now encircled on three sides around Kurakhove. So Volodar fell about a month or so ago, a couple weeks ago. The Russians are making advances to Volodar's north. So Kurakhove is now more or less surrounded on three sides. To the north, around Kupiansk, and to its east, around Marinka, and to its south, around Volodar. So, three parts of around Kurakhove are now under Russian control. The Russians are trying to push from Hostre to Ostrivke. So, Volodar fell, and now Kurakhove is now more or less, I wouldn't say fully encircled, but a semi-encirclement on three sides around Kurakhove. And then there's not a whole lot of movement around the rest of the line. It doesn't look like there's a whole lot of movement around Kherson or around Orakiv, Poloi. Not a whole lot of movement. Basically, the movement on the line is around Kurakhove. The Ukrainians are semi-encircled, but the one that I really want to touch on is, looks like the Ukrainians are now encircled on three sides around Kupiansk direction, because now the Russians have forced their way to the Oskil Reservoir. And now there's a bulge in the line, and the Russians are ultimately trying to force the Ukrainians back towards Kupiansk and to take this territory. So, looks like the Ukrainians are encircled on three sides around Kupiansk, but also around Kurakhove. So the Russians are, this is their target. They're trying to force the Ukrainians back from Kurakhove. Looks like the Russians are also trying to push the Ukrainians back towards Kupiansk in the north. Not a whole lot of movement around Vovchansk, and some movement around the Ukrainian advance into Kursk. So that's the update video for the war in Ukraine. Thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate it, and I will see you all in the next video. Deuces.